Hello, and this is Professor Choi again. We're here today to talk about something called the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, as you can see there. Now today we're going to cover only the basics, and this might not be 100% correct because I'm trying to cover it in a short video, but these are the basics of something called the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, and how exactly does fiscal policy stimulate the economy. In other words, when the government creates something called a stimulus plan, how exactly does a stimulus plan generate economic activity? Alright, so this is what we call the aggregate supply, aggregate demand model, and it's missing a few parts again because I want to condense it and make it simple for whoever's watching this video. But on this side, we have, this is what we call the price level in the economy, and the price level is maintained with something called using CPI, which stands for Consumer Price Index, or what we call the GDP deflator. Then we have something called real GDP. Real GDP on this side is basically the metric for economic activity that is inflation adjusted. So this is sort of output but adjusted for inflation in the economy. And equilibrium is the point in the center, which is the one that tells you where the economy actually is. This is what we call the short-run aggregate supply, and the short-run aggregate supply basically represents business in the economy and anybody who produces anything. So this represents the behavior of producers. And then aggregate demand represents the behavior of consumers. So what we're basically saying when we're using this model is that the economy is composed of consumers and producers. Okay? That's basically what this is saying. Now the center or equilibrium is what determines where economic activity is going when we change the behavior of consumers and producers. Now the behavior of consumers is downward sloping in this model because every time prices go up, people are willing to buy less things. And if you think about the moving from one point to another point here, then basically this line, this downward sloping line basically says that when prices go up, this number drops. Alright? This upward sloping line basically means that when prices go up, we produce more. So a simple way of thinking about this is imagine a house. Okay? The higher the price of a house, the more producers are willing to produce houses. So the higher the price of a house, the more you want to produce houses because the more money you're going to be making selling houses. The consumers, on the other hand, don't want that. So the higher the price of the house, the less they're willing to buy houses. So it's always a tug of war between producers and consumers or where we're going to end up in terms of production and prices. The list that you see here is the list of things that make the short-run aggregate supply shift to the right. And a shift is when we move the entire line from wherever it is to a point on the right of that. Okay? Now, if we have our aggregate demand, the following is the list of things that make the aggregate demand shift to the right. Okay? Now the opposite on that list makes it shift to the left. So the opposite of what you see here makes that line shift to the left, and it makes this line shift to the left. Alright, now with that in mind, let's talk about what exactly is a stimulus plan, which is really what we're here for. Alright, so again, hopefully you can remember some of these. Take a good look at it. Alright. So, let's talk about a stimulus plan. A stimulus plan is basically when the government decides to either cut taxes or increase government spending. Now, what exactly is a tax cut? Well, in the year 2008, in order to try to stimulate the economy and get it out of a recession, during the President Bush Jr. administration, we decided that we were going to cut taxes for every taxpayer by $600. So, every taxpayer received somewhere around $600, somewhere around the summer of 2008. That stimulus was just not enough, and the economy entered a recession. somewhere around the year 2008, and it continued into the summer of 2009. In the year 2020, Congress has now done something very similar. They have decided that they're going to provide every taxpayer who paid taxes in 2019 a check for somewhere around $1,200. And if you want the specifics, by the way, I'm pretty sure they're online. But basically, taxpayers that make up to $75,000 are supposed to receive $1,200 from the government, and it's supposed to hit your bank about a few weeks from the moment that they announce it, all right, or maybe a month. So that's what a tax cut looks like. Another way in which you can receive a tax cut is when the government decides to decrease the margin. So when the marginal rate of taxes decreases is another way in which we can have a tax cut. In other words, when we cut the rate at which you pay taxes, which in the US is progressive. So the higher the income level, the higher the tax rate, and the lower the income level, the lower the tax rate. So when we decide to drop those tax rates, that's a tax cut. Now, an increase in government spending is basically when the government comes in and decides to spend money on something. So when the government decides to increase, for example, spending on the military, or when the government decides to buy something for the government, or you can even think about the census in 2020. Okay? Or when the government decides to spend more money on, say, welfare programs or things of that sort, or maybe, again, an increase in Social Security payments or things of that sort. All right, so that's an increase in government spending. All right, now, what happens when you do a stimulus plan? So a stimulus plan is those two things. It's either a tax cut or an increase in government spending. And what that basically does is it makes consumers consume a little bit more than before, or that's what you want, and then it make companies invest more money. Now, if you know the basic formula for gross domestic product, the basic formula for GDP is consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. And that's in the most basic breakdown of how we measure gross domestic product, which is the number that we use to measure economic activity. All right, during a recession, what normally happens is there'll be a decrease in consumption and there'll be a decrease in investment, and therefore you see a decrease in GDP, which is what we call a recession. The reason the government creates a stimulus plan is because it makes the economy move in the opposite direction from what you have in that particular recession. So when you cut taxes, the idea is that consumption and investment might increase because now you're receiving more money and you may want to spend it. And when the government decides to increase government expenditures, it's a direct injection into economic activity. So a stimulus plan is something that you normally use when the aggregate demand is moving to the left. So as you enter a recession, what you see is a shift to the left of aggregate demand, and what the government is basically trying to do by passing a stimulus plan is they're trying to basically push the aggregate demand in the opposite direction of where the aggregate demand is moving. So a recession is created because when equilibrium changes from 1 to 2, you're going to see a decrease in real GDP, and that's what we call a recession. And then a stimulus plan is supposed to move the economic activity in the opposite direction. So it's supposed to change that equilibrium back to a higher number, and therefore move real GDP in the upward direction. So a recession causes real GDP to decrease, a stimulus plan causes real GDP to increase. Alright? And that's basically how a stimulus plan and fiscal policy are supposed to help economic activity. I hope you learned some from Professor Choi and my short videos. Keep following me, and thank you for sticking by. Have a good one.